A single father lost the first-class seat he had paid for because a wealthy woman decided he did not look important enough to keep it. 5 minutes later, every passenger on the plane was ordered to leave. But this story is not really about a seat. It is about the moment a quiet man must choose between revealing his power and discovering how people treat him when they believe he has none. Under the cold cabin lights, Mason Reed held his 10-year-old daughter's trembling hand while strangers watched in silence. Her science project rested beneath the seat. Her mother's memorial ribbon was pinned to her backpack. And when she whispered, "Dad, did we do something wrong?" something inside him changed. Stay until the end, because what happened next exposed more than prejudice. It revealed what real authority is meant to protect. Like this video and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. To understand why Mason Reed stayed so calm inside that cabin, you have to go back 90 minutes before anyone mistook his silence for weakness. Morning had barely reached the outskirts of Charlotte when the kitchen lights came on in the small brick house at the end of Willow Creek Lane. The sky outside was still the color of cold steel. Rain clung to the windows in thin silver trails, and the neighborhood rested beneath the soft hum of distant traffic. Mason stood at the counter with one hand around a coffee mug and the other turning a tiny screwdriver between his fingers. He wore a pale blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His charcoal coat hung over the back of a chair, faded at the elbows from years of use. Across from him, Sophie Reed sat beneath the warm light above the kitchen table. A small rover rested in front of her, built from light aluminum black wheels and a narrow solar panel no larger than a paperback book. One of the wheels leaned at an angle. Sophie pressed her lips together as she tried to fit it back into place. "It keeps slipping," she said. Mason set down his coffee and crouched beside her. "Let me see. I already checked the axle. That sounds serious. It is serious." Her tone was sharp enough to sound grown, but the way she held the wheel gave her away. Her fingers were trembling. Mason took the rover gently. The little machine had occupied their dining room for almost 3 months. Wires had appeared in cereal bowls. Screws had turned up beneath sofa cushions. A piece of copper tape had once stuck to the bottom of Mason's shoe and followed him into a board meeting. He turned the wheel once, then twice. "The axle is fine," he said. Sophie frowned. "Then why does it keep falling off?" "Because the locking pin is backward." She leaned closer. "It is not." Mason removed the pin and held it under the light. Sophie stared at it. Then she sighed. Mom would have fixed it faster. The room changed, not dramatically. No sound disappeared. The rain did not stop. The refrigerator continued its low mechanical hum. Yet Mason felt the same invisible shift that always followed Lauren's name. He looked toward the framed photograph beside the coffee machine. Lauren was standing on a beach in North Carolina, laughing into the wind. Sophie, 5 years old in the picture, sat on her shoulders with both arms raised. Mason stood beside them, one hand on Lauren's back, caught in the moment before all 3 of them collapsed into the sand. Mason looked back at the rover. "Your mom once tried to fix a toaster and shut off the power to half the house." Sophie blinked. "That did not happen. It absolutely happened. She said the wiring was old. She also said the toaster was poorly designed. Was it no? She had put a spoon inside it." Sophie stared at him for a second, then laughed. The sound filled the kitchen so suddenly that Mason had to look down. There were mornings when her laughter still surprised him. Not because Sophie had become a sad child. She had not. She was curious, stubborn, and capable of asking 20 questions before breakfast. But grief had taught both of them to be careful with joy, as though too much of it might feel disloyal. Mason turned the locking pin around and secured the wheel. He pushed the rover across the table. It rolled in a straight line and stopped beside Sophie's orange juice. Fixed. Sophie inspected it with professional seriousness. Acceptable. High praise. She reached for the rover, then looked at the photograph again. The memorial ribbon was already pinned to the front of her navy backpack. It was simple white cloth with Lauren's name stitched in blue. Sophie touched the edge of it. "Do we have to go straight there after we land?" Mason sat in the chair beside her. "We have time to check into the hotel first. What if everybody cries? Some people probably will. What if Grandma cries?" She probably will. What if I cry? Mason rested his forearms on the table. Then you cry. Sophie watched him closely. What if I cannot stop before the competition? He reached over and straightened the solar panel. Then we sit together until you can breathe again, and if I still cannot stop, then you present while crying. She gave him a doubtful look. People do that. People do almost everything while crying. They just do not put it in the photographs. Sophie lowered her eyes. The Rocky Mountain Junior Science Challenge had been circled on their calendar for 6 months. The memorial gathering had been planned later after Lauren's mother learned they would already be in Denver. Mason had tried to move one of the events. Sophie refused. She wanted to stand beside her mother's family that afternoon and present her rover the next morning. To her, the two events belonged together. Lauren had been the first person to encourage every strange question Sophie asked. She had bought her first science kit, then pretended not to mind when Sophie used the dining room lamps to power a homemade weather station. Mason had booked the earliest direct flight from Charlotte. He had chosen seats 1A and 1B because takeoff had become difficult for Sophie after Lauren died. Near the front, she could see the flight attendants. She could hear fewer engine vibrations. Most important, she could keep one hand around Mason's without feeling that other passengers were watching. He had not told her any of that. He had simply said the front row gave the rover more protection. Sophie studied her father. Do you still miss her every day? Mason could have softened the answer. He could have told her that time made it easier. Adults often offered children promises because uncertainty frightened them. Instead, he looked at Lauren's photograph. Yes. Sophie waited. Mason picked up his coffee, though it had already gone cold. Missing someone and moving forward can happen at the same time. How I am still figuring that out. Sophie nodded slowly. She seemed relieved that he did not have a perfect answer. Mason's phone vibrated on the counter. The screen lit with Jonah Pierce's name. He let the call end. A message appeared a moment later. Board review moved to Monday. Need your approval on the Hale Dominion proposal. Mason turned the phone face down. Sophie noticed. Work. You said today was not a work day. It is not. Then why do they keep calling? Because they are deeply committed to testing my patience. She looked pleased by the answer. Mason had founded Crown Line Airways 17 years earlier with 2 rented offices, 1 aging regional aircraft, and more confidence than money. Before that, he had worked as an aircraft mechanic, then as an operations analyst. He understood airplanes from the ground up, not from executive reports. His name appeared in industry publications, investor documents, and company announcements. But most passengers would not recognize his face. Many Crown Line employees would not either. He preferred it that way. He rarely appeared in advertisements. He avoided ceremony. He traveled under his personal account and refused the executive marker that would automatically alert crews when he booked a flight. Lauren had understood why. Years earlier, after a delayed flight left them waiting beside a family with a crying infant, she had told him something he never forgot. You cannot know what your company feels like from a boardroom. After her death, Mason had kept the habit. He flew quietly. He waited in regular security lines. He watched how employees behaved when they believed nobody important was looking. But that morning was not an inspection. He was not Chairman Reed. He was Sophie's father, trying to get her to Denver before grief and exhaustion made the day heavier than it already was. He checked the time. We should leave. Sophie placed the rover inside its padded case, then slid the case carefully into her backpack. Mason picked up the bag. She immediately took it from him. I can carry it. I know. You always say that, then you keep holding things. Mason raised both hands. Sophie pulled the straps over her shoulders. At the front door, Mason reached for his coat. The fabric had softened over the years, and one sleeve carried a faint line where Lauren had once repaired a tear by hand. He owned newer coats. He wore this one anyway. Outside rain whispered against the driveway. The airport was already awake when they arrived. Charlotte Douglas moved with its usual early morning rhythm. Wheels clicked over tile. Coffee machines hissed behind counters. Boarding announcements blended with conversations coughing and the distant rumble of aircraft beyond the glass. Sophie walked close to Mason through the main terminal. She watched every sign even though Mason knew the route. Gate B12, she said, that is what the app says. Apps can be wrong, so can signs. So can Dad's. Mason glanced at her. Careful. She almost smiled. They stopped at a coffee counter near the central atrium. Mason ordered black coffee for himself and hot chocolate for Sophie. While he reached for his wallet, the zipper on Sophie's backpack caught on the edge of the counter. The bag opened. A small plastic container slipped out, hit the floor, and burst apart. Sensors, wires, screws, and 2 narrow circuit boards scattered across the tile. Sophie froze. No, she dropped to her knees. Mason set down the coffee and moved beside her, but someone else reached the nearest sensor first. A woman in navy slacks and a soft gray sweater knelt on the other side of the scattered pieces. Her dark blonde hair was gathered loosely at the back of her neck, and a hospital identification badge peeked from the outer pocket of her bag. She held up the sensor between 2 fingers. "Please tell me this is not the part that controls the brakes." Sophie looked at her. "It measures distance." The woman nodded. "So it notices trouble before everyone else does." "Yes. That is usually the part nobody listens to." Mason collected the screws. "You sound like you have met a few hospital administrators." The woman looked at him surprised. Then she smiled. "Pediatric emergency nurse. That explains the calm. No, that explains the coffee." She reached beneath a chair and recovered another circuit board. Her name badge read Avery Collins. Sophie took the board from her. "Thank you. You are welcome. What are you building?" "A solar-powered rover." Avery sat back on her heels. "For school for the Rocky Mountain Junior Science Challenge." "That sounds important. It is regional." "Regional sounds important." Sophie began placing the pieces back inside the container. The tension left her shoulders one careful breath at a time. Mason noticed Avery's attention move briefly toward the memorial ribbon pinned to the backpack. She read Lauren's name but did not ask a question. Instead, she pointed toward the rover case. "Does it have a name?" Sophie shook her head. "It is a prototype. Everything deserves a name. Machines do not care. Maybe that is why they behave better than people." Mason looked at Avery. She was not performing kindness. She was not speaking to Sophie in the falsely bright voice adults sometimes used with children. She was simply interested. Sophie considered the question. "Scout." Avery nodded. "Scout is a good name." The boarding announcement for Denver sounded above them. Avery stood and adjusted the strap of her bag. "That is me." Mason gathered the last screw. "Us too." They walked toward the gate together. Avery learned that Sophie was 10, that Scout could detect obstacles, and that Mason knew enough about wiring to be useful, but not enough to receive credit. Mason learned that Avery worked nights at a children's hospital outside Charlotte. She was traveling to Denver for a conference on pediatric emergency care. She had worked the previous night, slept for 2 hours, and was surviving on airport coffee and professional denial. At the gate, an agent scanned Avery's pass, then looked at the screen. "You have been upgraded to first class." Avery looked over her shoulder as though the agent might be speaking to someone else. "Why, we needed your economy seat for a family traveling together." Avery accepted the new boarding pass. "Apparently the universe has decided I need more legroom." Mason glanced at the pass. "Try not to let the power change you. I will remember the people in the back." Sophie smiled at that. The gate agent called the first boarding group. Mason and Sophie entered the jet bridge. Avery followed a few passengers behind them. Inside the aircraft, morning light stretched across the first-class cabin. A young flight attendant with a friendly face greeted Sophie. "Owen Brooks," he said, tapping his name badge. "Official guardian of overhead bins and suspicious science projects." Sophie held the backpack closer. "It is not suspicious. That is exactly what a suspicious science project would say." Mason smiled. Owen helped secure the rover beneath seat 1B, making sure nothing pressed against the case. Mason settled into 1A by the window. Sophie took 1B beside the aisle. Across from them, Avery found her upgraded seat in 2C. She raised the paper boarding pass. Still humble, Mason looked at the extra space around her knees. For now. Sophie removed a sketchbook and began drawing the wing outside the window. Mason fastened his seatbelt and watched ground crews move beneath the rain. For several minutes, the cabin felt calm. Then Melissa Crane entered. She carried herself with the polished control of someone who had worked premium cabins for years. Her uniform was immaculate. Her silver name badge caught the light as she checked the galley and reviewed the passenger list. Owen mentioned Sophie's rover. Melissa glanced beneath the seat. As long as it remains completely secured. It is, Owen said. Melissa adjusted the placement by less than an inch. Completely means no movement. Owen corrected it without argument. Mason watched the exchange. Melissa was experienced, precise, accustomed to control. Nothing in her manner suggested carelessness. That detail would matter. Boarding continued. Business travelers entered with laptops and quiet irritation. A couple in matching raincoats took seats in row 3. A man near the aisle began a call before sitting down. Then Veronica Hale appeared at the aircraft door. The mood shifted before she spoke. She wore a white designer suit beneath a cream coat, and every movement seemed shaped by the expectation that space would open for her. A nervous assistant followed with a leather case and 2 phones. Several passengers recognized her. Veronica Hale was the chief executive of Hale Dominion Group, a national property and logistics company with offices across the country. She stepped into the cabin and looked toward the front row. Her eyes stopped on Mason, then on seat 1A. She checked her boarding pass. It read 3D. Her expression tightened. Melissa approached with a professional smile. "Good morning, Ms. Hale. This is not the seat I requested." Melissa looked at the pass. 3D is your confirmed assignment. It is beside the galley. Yes, ma'am. I have confidential calls before departure. The aircraft doors will close shortly. Veronica lowered her voice, but not enough to keep nearby passengers from hearing. Hale Dominion is selecting a preferred airline for 1,200 employees. Melissa's smile remained fixed. I understand. Do you? Veronica glanced at Mason again. I remember companies that know how to recognize important relationships. Her assistant looked at the floor. Melissa followed Veronica's gaze toward 1A. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she walked to Mason's row. Sophie continued drawing. Mason looked up. Melissa asked to see his boarding pass. He handed it to her. She checked the name, the flight number, and the seat. Everything was correct. Avery watched from across the aisle. Melissa then checked Veronica's boarding pass. Seat 3D. No duplicate assignment, no system error. The truth rested openly in her hands. Mason saw the Hale Dominion logo on the folder beneath Veronica's arm. He saw Melissa notice it too. The flight attendant's expression changed so slightly that another passenger might have missed it. Mason did not. Melissa returned his pass. There appears to be a seating irregularity. Mason glanced at Sophie, then back at Melissa. What irregularity? Veronica stepped closer. The diamond bracelet at her wrist flashed beneath the cabin lights. Her eyes moved over Mason's faded coat, his plain shirt, and the worn edges of his shoes. Then she looked at Melissa. Get him out of my seat. The words were delivered with the confidence of someone who had rarely heard the word no. For a moment, nobody moved. Rain streaked the oval windows. A baggage cart crawled across the wet pavement below its amber light blinking through the gray morning. Inside the cabin, the quiet hum of ventilation suddenly seemed louder than the passengers. Mason remained seated. Sophie's pencil stopped above her sketchbook. Melissa looked down at the 2 boarding passes still in her hand. Mason's pass showed 1A, Veronica's showed 3D. There was nothing to interpret. Mason watched Melissa's eyes return to the Hale Dominion folder beneath Veronica's arm. Ms. Hale, Melissa said carefully, your confirmed seat is in row 3. Veronica did not look at her. I requested the front window seat 3 weeks ago. A request is not a confirmation, Mason said. Veronica turned toward him slowly. The expression on her face suggested that the interruption itself had offended her. I was not speaking to you. You were speaking about my seat. It should never have been assigned to you. Mason glanced at his boarding pass. It has my name on it. Veronica smiled without warmth. People print all kinds of things at home. A few passengers shifted in their seats. The man in 2A lowered his phone from his ear. The couple in row 3 exchanged a quick look. Nobody spoke. Sophie looked toward Avery. Avery was no longer smiling. Melissa extended Mason's boarding pass back to him. There may have been a system irregularity. Mason took it but did not look away from her. You just confirmed there was no duplicate assignment. I said there may be an irregularity. What changed in the last 30 seconds? Melissa's posture stiffened. Sir, I am trying to resolve this professionally. So am I. Veronica let out a quiet laugh. This is exactly the problem with lowering standards. People begin to confuse access with belonging. Mason's eyes moved to her. Standards are useful. He held up the boarding pass. This is one of them. Avery looked down, hiding a brief smile. Veronica noticed. And who are you, a passenger? Then behave like one. Avery leaned back in her seat. I thought passengers were allowed to sit in the seats printed on their tickets. Melissa turned toward her. Miss Collins, please allow the crew to handle this. Avery glanced at Mason's boarding pass, then at Veronica's. I am watching the crew refuse to handle it. The silence in the cabin changed. A few passengers looked toward Avery with interest. Others looked away, already uncomfortable with the possibility that they might be expected to choose a side. Melissa lowered her voice. Remain seated and do not interfere. I am seated. Then remain uninvolved. Avery's gaze settled on Sophie. That became difficult when you started discussing separating a child from her father. Melissa had not yet proposed that. The statement made her pause. Mason saw the calculation behind her eyes. Avery had forced the issue into the open before Melissa could disguise it as a routine seat adjustment. Melissa turned back to Mason. We can offer you another seat in the main cabin. What seat I will need to check availability. And my daughter, she can remain here. Sophie's head lifted. Mason's voice stayed calm. No. Melissa tapped the screen of her tablet. There are no adjacent seats currently available in the main cabin. Then there is no suitable reassignment. We can place you in row 29, and Sophie, your daughter, may stay in 1B. Mason looked at her for a long moment. She is 10 years old. She will be under the supervision of the flight crew. She is traveling with me. We are aware of that. Then you are aware that your solution separates a child from her only parent. The word only landed quietly. Avery heard it. So did Sophie. Veronica folded her arms. She will survive 2 hours without him. Sophie's face reddened. Avery turned toward Veronica. She should not have to. Veronica stared at her. Are you always this involved in other people's problems? I work in pediatric emergency care. That was not my question. No, Avery said. I am not always this involved. She looked at Sophie. Only when adults are making a frightened child pay for their bad decisions. Melissa stepped into the aisle between them. That is enough. Her voice was sharper now. Avery sat back, but her eyes remained on Sophie. Mason leaned toward his daughter. Look at me. Sophie tried. Her breathing had become shallow. Mason rested one hand over hers. Slow down. I am trying. I know. Avery watched Sophie's fingers tighten around the edge of the sketchbook. She recognized the signs immediately. Sophie, she said gently. Melissa turned. I told you not to interfere. Avery ignored her. Sophie, look at the buckle on your backpack. Sophie's eyes moved downward. The silver one, Avery said. Can you see it? Sophie nodded. Tell me 3 things you can see. Mason understood. He followed Avery's tone. Go ahead, Soph. Sophie swallowed. The buckle. Good. Dad's sleeve. One more. The window. Avery nodded. Now 2 things you can hear. Sophie listened. The air. Mason smiled faintly. And someone closing a bin. Her breathing began to slow. Avery rested her hands in her lap. You are doing fine. Melissa looked from Avery to Mason, irritated that the moment had slipped beyond her control. Veronica checked her watch. This has already taken too long. Melissa touched the communication panel beside the galley. I am calling the terminal manager. Mason looked at her tablet. You still have not answered the original question. What question? What operational reason requires moving me? Melissa kept her hand near the panel. I am not obligated to discuss internal decisions. You are asking for my consent. I am directing a seating change. That is not the same thing. Veronica moved closer. The scent of expensive perfume reached Mason before she did. Do you have any idea how much my company spends on travel every year? No. You should. Why? Because that spending keeps airlines like this one profitable. Mason studied her. Does it purchase other passengers' seats? It purchases consideration. You already have a first-class seat, not the one I requested. Then your problem is with the request process. Her eyes narrowed. You are enjoying this. No, you think this makes you important. Mason glanced at Sophie. No, I think it is making my daughter afraid. For the first time, Veronica looked directly at the child. There was no sympathy in her expression, only impatience. "Then stop prolonging it." Mason's jaw tightened. Avery saw it. Until that moment, Mason's calm had looked effortless. Now she understood it was not calm at all. It was restraint. Melissa spoke into the cabin phone. "Gate B12, this is lead cabin crew. I need terminal management on board." She paused. "We have an uncooperative passenger refusing a required reassignment." Mason looked at her. "You have not required anything in writing." Melissa turned away. "He is obstructing boarding and causing distress in the premium cabin." Avery's eyebrows rose. "Distress?" Melissa ended the call. "Ms. Collins, no, I would like to understand. Is the distress coming from the child trying not to panic or from the executive who does not like row 3? The man in 2A coughed to hide a laugh. Melissa looked toward him. He immediately lowered his eyes to his phone. Nobody joined Avery. That was the moment the cabin made its choice. Not in favor of Veronica exactly, in favor of comfort. A passenger near row 4 checked the time and whispered that she had a connection in Denver. Another man muttered that Mason should take the voucher and settle it later. Someone behind the curtain asked how long the delay would be. Their voices were not cruel. That made them worse. Cruelty could be confronted. Impatience disguised itself as reason. Sophie heard every word. "Dad," she whispered, "maybe we should just go." Mason looked at her. Her eyes were fixed on her lap. She did not believe they were wrong. She wanted to disappear. Mason felt something deep inside his chest pull tight. He could end the confrontation in seconds. His phone was in his pocket. Jonah Pierce would answer on the first ring. So would half the airline's senior leadership. Mason could give his name watch. Melissa's expression changed and returned the entire cabin to order before security reached the gate. But then Sophie would learn something worse. She would learn that the rules had protected them only because her father possessed the power to frighten the people breaking them. He looked toward Avery. She had no idea who he was. She had seen only a father and a child being treated unfairly, and she had spoken. Footsteps sounded in the jet bridge. A broad man in a dark suit entered the cabin with an airport identification card clipped to his belt. Dean Rourke looked irritated before he reached the first row. His eyes moved from Melissa to Veronica, then to Mason. Melissa stepped toward him. "Thank you for coming. What is the issue?" She angled her body so Mason was partially blocked from the conversation. "We have a passenger refusing an operational seat reassignment." Dean looked past her. Mason held the boarding pass in plain view. Melissa continued. "He has become argumentative and is delaying departure." "I have not delayed anything," Mason said. Dean raised one hand. "I will speak with you in a moment." Mason lowered the ticket. Melissa explained that Veronica was a major corporate customer and that an accommodation had been requested for the front row. She did not mention that Veronica's assigned seat was already in first class. She did not mention that Mason had purchased 1A. She did not mention Sophie. Dean listened without interrupting. Then he turned toward Veronica. "Ms. Hale, I apologize for the inconvenience." Mason heard the apology clearly. It had been offered before Dean examined a single piece of evidence. Veronica nodded once. "I have been waiting for someone competent." Dean looked at Mason. "Sir, I understand there has been some confusion." "There is no confusion." Dean's expression tightened. "We need seat 1A for an operational accommodation." "What accommodation?" "That information is not relevant to your options. It is relevant if you are removing me from a confirmed seat." Dean glanced toward the passengers. He lowered his voice. "You can accept a seat in the main cabin along with a travel voucher. Next to my daughter, we are looking for available seating." Melissa handed Dean the tablet. He scanned it for less than a second. "There is one seat in row 29, and Sophie Dean looked at 1B. She can remain here." Avery stood. Dean turned toward her. "Please sit down. I am a pediatric emergency nurse. That does not give you authority in this cabin. No. It gives me experience with frightened children." She gestured toward Sophie. "You are proposing to separate her from her father after humiliating both of them in front of a full cabin." Dean's voice cooled. "You are interfering with crew operations. I am describing them. Sit down." Avery held his gaze. Then she lowered herself into her seat. "Consider my objection on the record." Dean looked toward Melissa. "Get her information. I will provide it, Avery said. You do not need to threaten me for it. Sophie looked at her with quiet gratitude. Dean turned back to Mason. Your daughter will be supervised by the flight crew. Mason looked at Melissa. She is the crew member who created the situation. Melissa's face hardened. Dean stepped closer. You need to make a decision. I already made one when I purchased the tickets. Airlines reserve the right to change seat assignments for operational and safety reasons. This is an operational matter. Then state the reason. I am not debating policy with you. I am not asking for a debate. I am asking you to document your decision. Dean glanced at the open cabin door. We are trying to keep this flight on schedule, then move the passenger to the seat printed on her ticket. Veronica laughed. Dean looked at her, then back at Mason. You are being offered reasonable accommodation. You are offering to place me 27 rows from my child. She is old enough to sit independently. Sophie flinched. Mason saw it. She is not traveling independently. Dean's patience broke. If you refuse a lawful crew instruction, airport security will remove you. The word settled over the cabin. Someone near the back of first class began recording. Mason noticed the phone held just above the armrest. He noticed other things too. Melissa's badge, Dean's identification number, the position of the tablet in Melissa's hand. The original passenger screen had shown his name beside 1A. Now the field was blank. Melissa tapped the screen. A menu opened. Mason caught a glimpse of several codes. Operational reassignment, equipment change, medical accommodation, voluntary cabin change. Her finger hovered. Then she selected the last one. Mason's name disappeared from seat 1A. Veronica's appeared in its place. Mason leaned slightly into the aisle. What code did you use? Melissa locked the tablet. That is internal information. You marked it voluntary. Dean stepped between them. You do not have access to the system. I can read. Melissa held the tablet against her body. Mason's voice remained even. I did not consent. You are being given an option. An option presented under threat of security removal is not voluntary consent. Dean shook his head. You are trying to turn a routine seat change into a legal argument. No. Mason looked at the tablet. I am telling you that the record no longer reflects what happened. Dean leaned closer. What is your name? Mason held up the boarding pass. You have it. Dean took the paper and glanced at it. Mason Reed. Nothing in his face changed. The name meant nothing to him. Mason almost felt relieved. Dean handed the pass back. You can leave voluntarily or you can be escorted off. Veronica crossed her arms. This is absurd. Remove him. The businessman filming tilted his phone slightly higher. A woman in row 3 sighed loudly. I have a connection. Another passenger whispered, just take the voucher. Sophie's eyes filled. She looked up at Mason. Did we do something wrong? The cabin fell quiet. For 1 second, even Veronica had no answer. Mason looked at his daughter. No. Then why are they angry at us? He felt every passenger waiting for him to respond. He could tell her the truth. Because they believe money is evidence. Because silence is easier than courage. Because people often blame the person who exposes a problem instead of the person who created it. But she was 10 years old, frightened and surrounded by strangers. Mason reached for her hand. They are in a hurry. That is not our fault. No. Then why do we have to move? Mason looked toward Avery. She met his eyes. There was anger in her face, but no demand. She was not asking him to fight for her satisfaction. She was waiting to see what Sophie needed. Mason looked back at his daughter. She did not need a dramatic victory. She needed to know her father would not abandon her. He unfastened his seatbelt. Veronica smiled. Melissa exhaled. Dean stepped back as though the problem had been solved. Mason helped Sophie close her sketchbook. He checked the padded rover case beneath the seat and slid it carefully into her backpack. Sophie stood. Avery rose halfway, then stopped herself. Mason lifted Sophie's backpack onto her shoulders. Whatever you decide, Avery said quietly, she knows you did nothing wrong. Mason looked at her. In a cabin full of witnesses, she was the only person who had offered them dignity without knowing whether they could return the favor. Thank you, he said. Veronica moved aside just enough to let them pass. As Mason stepped into the aisle, she looked at his coat, his shoes, and the plain leather wallet in his hand. Next time, she said loudly, buy a seat that matches your station in life. Sophie lowered her eyes. Mason stopped. He turned not toward Veronica, but toward Melissa. He placed his folded boarding pass on the armrest of 1A. You saw both tickets. Melissa said nothing. You knew the assignment was valid. Dean pointed toward the door. Keep moving. Mason glanced at the tablet. You did not just move a passenger. Melissa's fingers tightened around the device. You changed the record. A flicker of fear crossed her face. It was gone almost immediately. Dean stepped closer. That is enough. Mason slid his wallet into his coat pocket. For a second, the wallet caught against the fabric. A black metal card slipped halfway out. A silver emblem flashed beneath the cabin lights, a crown above a pair of wings. Melissa stared at it. She had seen that emblem before embossed on executive security folders and restricted board documents. Before she could read the engraved name beneath it, Mason pushed the card back into his wallet. He took Sophie's hand. Together they walked toward the aircraft door. Behind them, Veronica sat in 1A. She placed one hand over Mason's folded boarding pass without looking at it. Melissa faced the cabin. The seating issue has been resolved. A few passengers relaxed. Someone returned a bag to the overhead bin. The woman with the connection checked her watch. The businessman kept recording until Mason and Sophie disappeared into the jet bridge. Outside the aircraft, the air was colder. The narrow passage smelled of rain metal and jet fuel. The walls vibrated faintly with the engines of another plane moving nearby. A gate employee waited with a handheld device. Dean followed them out. Find 2 seats in the main cabin, he told her. The employee checked the screen. There are no seats together, then separate seats. Sophie moved closer to Mason. The employee hesitated. She is a minor. Dean looked toward the aircraft door. Keep searching. Mason stood against the wall with Sophie beside him. He did not demand a better seat. He did not ask for Veronica to be removed. He watched the employee move through the reservation screens. Inside the cabin, boarding resumed. Through the open doorway, Mason could see Melissa speaking quietly to Veronica. Avery remained seated across the aisle looking toward the jet bridge. Sophie held both backpack straps. Her face was still red. Why did you not tell them? Mason looked down at her. Tell them what? She frowned. Who you are? Dean turned slightly. The gate employee looked up. Mason crouched so he and Sophie were at the same height. Her eyes were wet, but she was no longer panicking. You think they would have listened? Yes. They probably would have. Then why did you let them think we were lying? The question hurt more because she asked it without accusation. Mason rested one hand on her shoulder. Because if they respect us only after they learn I have power, then they never respected us. Sophie looked toward the cabin. But they made everyone think we did something wrong. Truth does not become weaker because a room full of people refuses to recognize it. She considered that. They still got the seat. Mason glanced at 1A where Veronica now sat beside the window. This is not about getting the seat back. It was our seat. Yes. Then what is it about? Mason looked at the gate employee's screen. It is about what they changed to take it. Sophie followed his gaze. The employee had reopened Mason's reservation. His original assignment was gone. Beside his name was a new status. Passenger accepted voluntary reassignment. Sophie's name remained beside 1B. The record now suggested that Mason had willingly moved away from her. Mason stood. Was that entered as voluntary? The employee froze. Her eyes moved toward Dean. Dean stepped between Mason and the screen. Internal coding is not your concern. It concerns me when it describes consent I never gave. We are trying to accommodate you. You are trying to create 2 scattered seats after recording that I agreed to leave my daughter. Dean's face tightened. You stood up. After you threatened to call security. You complied with the crew instruction. That is not consent. Dean moved closer. You are not in a position to tell airline personnel how to manage the system. Mason looked past him toward the aircraft. Melissa had returned to the galley. Avery remained visible through the open doorway. She was watching him. Sophie tugged gently at Mason's sleeve. Dad. He looked down. Ms. Avery listened before she knew. Mason followed Sophie's gaze. Yes, he said, she did. Avery saw him looking and gave Sophie a small nod. The gesture was simple. No performance, no curiosity about his identity, no attempt to make herself important. Mason felt something shift inside him, something separate from the anger and humiliation. It had been a long time since a stranger's kindness had unsettled him. The gate employee returned to the screen. I found one seat in row 29 and another in row 32. Dean nodded. Assign them. Mason held up one hand. Do not change anything else. The employee stopped. Dean gave a short laugh. You do not have the authority to give instructions to my staff. No, Mason said. Footsteps approached from the terminal side of the jet bridge. 3 people turned the corner. The man in front wore a dark crown-lined suit and carried no luggage. 2 operations supervisors followed behind him. Jonah Pierce had been conducting an unannounced gate review in the neighboring concourse when he received notice that a boarding dispute was delaying Flight 482. He expected an angry traveler. He expected a tired employee. He did not expect Mason Reed. Jonah slowed. One of the supervisors nearly walked into him. His eyes moved first to Mason, then to Sophie, then to Dean standing between them and the reservation screen. The color left his face. Mr. Reed Dean turned toward him, irritated by the interruption. Jonah took another step. His gaze settled on Sophie's memorial ribbon, the backpack clutched against her chest, and the open aircraft door behind them. Then he looked directly at Dean. Why is the chairman of Crown Line Airways standing outside his own plane? The question seemed to remove the air from the jet bridge. Dean looked at Jonah, then at Mason, then back at Jonah as though the answer might change if he waited long enough. The gate employee stopped touching the screen. One of the operations supervisors straightened immediately. The other lowered the radio in his hand and stared at Mason's faded coat. Sophie remained close to her father. Nothing about Mason had changed. His shirt was still plain. His shoes were still worn at the edges. The memorial ribbon was still pinned to Sophie's backpack. Only the way people looked at him had changed. Dean's mouth opened. No, he said quietly. Jonah heard him. No, Dean forced a nervous laugh. There has to be some confusion. Mason looked at the reservation screen behind him. That word has been used several times this morning. Jonah stepped closer. He had known Mason for more than a decade. They had argued over aircraft purchases, route closures, labor contracts, and emergency budgets. He had seen Mason remain calm during storms that shut down 3 airports at once. He had never seen him standing in a jet bridge while his daughter fought back tears. Jonah looked at Sophie. Are you all right? Sophie nodded, but her fingers tightened around Mason's hand. Mason answered for her. She was asked to remain in first class while I sat in row 29. Jonah turned toward Dean. Dean lifted both hands. We were trying to find a solution. You tried to separate her from her father. The cabin was full. Jonah looked toward the open aircraft door. Why were they moved at all? Dean glanced at Mason. The confidence he had carried inside the cabin was disappearing one piece at a time. There was an operational accommodation. Mason spoke before Jonah could. What was the operational reason Dean looked toward the gate employee? She lowered her eyes. Jonah waited. Dean cleared his throat. It involved a priority corporate passenger. That is not an operational reason, Jonah said. Dean shifted his weight. Ms. Hale had requested the front seat. Jonah stared at him. Requested yes. Was it assigned to her? Dean did not answer. Mason took his folded boarding pass from his coat pocket and handed it to Jonah. Jonah opened it. Seat 1A. He looked toward Sophie. And hers. Seat 1B, Mason said. Jonah handed the paper back. Who approved the change? Dean glanced toward the aircraft. Melissa processed it. And you reviewed it? I approved the crew's decision. After reviewing the reservation, Dean hesitated. Mason watched Jonah's expression harden. Jonah rarely raised his voice. He did not need to. He had spent years in operations where the quietest person in a crisis often possessed the most control. Did you review the reservation? He asked again. I relied on Melissa's report. Jonah looked toward the gate employee's screen. What does the current record show? The employee swallowed. Mason Reed is listed without an assigned seat in the main cabin, and Sophie Reed still in 1B. Jonah's eyes moved to Mason. Mason spoke calmly. The system says I accepted the change voluntarily. Jonah looked at Dean. Did he? Dean's face tightened. He stood up and left the seat. After you threatened to remove him with security, Mason said. Jonah closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them, he looked toward the two supervisors behind him. "Stop all activity on this reservation." Dean stepped forward. "Jonah, we do not need to escalate this." Jonah turned slowly. "You altered the chairman's passenger record." Dean lowered his voice. "We did not know who he was." Mason's gaze settled on him. Jonah looked at Dean with open disbelief. "That sentence does not help you." Dean realized it too late. He turned toward Mason. "Mr. Reed, if you had identified yourself, none of this would have happened." Sophie looked up at her father. Mason did not answer immediately. The distant sound of boarding continued inside the cabin. Bags moved into overhead compartments. Seat belts clicked. Passengers who believed the dispute had ended prepared for departure. Mason looked through the open door. Veronica sat in 1A, one arm resting on the window ledge. Melissa stood near the galley speaking into the cabin phone. Then Mason looked back at Dean. "My name was on the boarding pass." Dean said nothing. "My daughter's age was in the reservation." Mason's voice remained low. "The seat assignments were confirmed before we entered the aircraft. None of those facts required me to identify myself as chairman." Dean glanced toward Jonah. "I was trying to protect the departure time." Mason turned to the gate employee. "Can you show Jonah the status code attached to my change?" Dean stepped between them again. Mason looked at him. Dean moved aside. The employee opened the record. Jonah leaned towards the screen. The words "voluntary cabin reassignment" appeared beside Mason's name. Jonah's jaw tightened. "Who selected this code?" The employee touched the activity log. Melissa Crane, who approved it. She opened another field. Dean Rourke. A heavy silence settled around them. Mason stepped closer to the screen. "What time was the approval entered?" 8:43 and 19 seconds. "When did Dean threaten to call security?" The employee looked uncertain. Avery's voice came from inside the aircraft. Before he stood up, everyone turned. She remained in her seat across the aisle, close enough to hear the conversation through the open door. Avery looked at Jonah. He did not agree to move. He stood after they told him security would remove him. Dean's face reddened. "You were instructed not to interfere." Avery did not look at him. "I am answering a question." Jonah looked from Avery to Mason. "Who is she, a witness?" Mason said. The answer was simple, but Avery heard the respect inside it. Jonah turned back to the screen. "We need compliance." Dean shook his head. "That will delay the flight." Mason looked at him. "The flight is already delayed. For a seat dispute, no." Mason pointed toward the altered reservation. "For a passenger record that no longer represents what happened." Dean stepped closer to Jonah. "We can correct it. Put Mr. Reed back in." A put his daughter beside him and closed the door. Mason shook his head. "I'm not asking for the seat." Dean stared at him. "What I do not want you to return me to 1A." Veronica looked toward the jet bridge when she heard the words. Melissa stopped speaking into the phone. Dean seemed unable to understand. "You have been demanding the seat for 20 minutes. I have been demanding that the confirmed assignment be honored. That is the same thing." "No." Mason pointed toward the reservation screen. "The seat can be returned in seconds. The record cannot be trusted until we know exactly what was changed and why." Dean glanced at the passengers inside the aircraft. "This is unnecessary." Mason looked at Jonah. "Can a confirmed passenger be moved without consent?" Jonah answered carefully. "Only for a documented safety or operational requirement." Was one documented, nor can a minor be separated from a parent without guardian approval under these circumstances? No. Can an employee describe forced compliance as voluntary consent? Nor Mason nodded toward the screen. Then this is not a customer service complaint. Jonah's eyes moved to the aircraft. He understood where Mason was going. Dean did not. "It is one field and one reservation," Dean said. Mason turned toward him. "How do you know?" Dean frowned. How do you know only one field was changed because this started with one seat?" "You did not review the record before approving it." Dean's face went still. "Melissa entered false information to make an unauthorized move appear legitimate. You approved it without checking the original reservation. What evidence do you have that no other passenger data was changed?" Dean looked toward the tablet inside the aircraft. He had none. Mason continued. "The manifest connects each passenger to a verified identity and a recorded location in the cabin. It includes guardian relationships, assistance requests, medical notes, security information, and baggage reconciliation. Sophie listened quietly beside him. The words were calm and technical, but the anger beneath them was unmistakable. If one employee can change a passenger's status to hide what happened, we cannot assume the remaining information is accurate until the full activity history is preserved and reviewed. Dean shook his head. You are making this sound like a security crisis. I am describing an integrity failure. The passengers are already seated. That does not make the record true. Jonah took out his phone. Dean reached toward him. Think about the cost. Jonah stepped away. Dean looked at Mason. We have more than 100 people on that aircraft. They have connections, meetings, families waiting for them. Mason's eyes sharpened. You were willing to separate my family to save a few minutes. Dean looked away. Mason lowered his voice. Do not use the other passengers now because you did not care about one passenger earlier. Jonah placed a call. This is Pierce. Lock the passenger record for Flight 482. He listened. Yes. Full compliance hold. Preserve every version and every user action from the beginning of boarding. Dean's face lost more color. Jonah continued. Remove departure clearance until the manifest is verified. A response came through the phone. Jonah looked at Mason. Operations wants to know whether the cabin should remain boarded. Mason did not answer immediately. He looked through the doorway at the passengers. Some were now watching the jet bridge openly. Others continued preparing for departure, unaware that the system holding their information had been locked. Mason turned toward Jonah. Can the crew complete final verification without access to a trusted manifest? No. Can operations certify that the current seat map matches the people physically on board? Not until compliance reviews the changes. Then the cabin must be cleared and rebuilt from the original record. Dean stepped forward. You cannot empty an aircraft over this. Mason looked at him. I am not emptying it because I lost a seat. He glanced toward Sophie. I am emptying it because you approved information you knew nothing about, and now the airline cannot prove what else may be wrong. Dean's eyes narrowed. You are using your authority because this happened to you. Mason held his gaze. If I were using my authority for myself, I would be sitting in 1A. The sentence left Dean with nowhere to go. Jonah spoke into the phone. Clear the cabin. Every passenger must leave with personal belongings. Reverification begins only after compliance releases the original data. He ended the call. The gate employee looked toward the aircraft. How long will it take? As long as it takes, Jonah said. Mason looked at him. Call Erin Sloan. Jonah nodded. She is in Concourse D for the safety audit. Bring her here. Dean gave a bitter laugh. The chief compliance officer, Mason, turned toward him. You approved the record. Melissa altered it. I am the passenger reporting the violation. He looked at Jonah. Erin leads the review. Jonah understood the instruction beneath the words. Mason did not want an investigation shaped by loyalty to him. He wanted evidence. Jonah called Erin. While he spoke, Mason crouched beside Sophie. You holding up? She looked toward the aircraft. Are all those people going to be mad at us, some of them? Because they have to leave, yes. Is it our fault? No. She studied his face. You are sure Mason touched the memorial ribbon on her backpack? I am sure. Sophie looked toward Avery. She stood up for us. Mason followed her gaze. Avery was still seated. Melissa now stood near her row, watching the jet bridge with growing unease. She did, Mason said. Do you know her? No. Sophie considered that. She acted like she did. Mason almost smiled. Some people do not need to know you before they care what happens to you. Dean stood several feet away, listening. The statement made him look toward the floor. Footsteps approached again. Erin Sloan entered the jet bridge carrying a slim laptop case. She wore a dark blue suit and flat shoes, suitable for walking terminals all day. Her hair was pulled back, and her expression carried the focused impatience of someone interrupted for a serious reason. She saw Jonah first, then Mason. Her eyes moved to Sophie Dean, the open aircraft door, and the reservation screen. What happened? Jonah began to speak. Mason raised one hand. I am the reporting passenger. Erin looked at him. For several seconds, neither of them moved. She had worked with Mason for 6 years. He had hired her after she exposed safety failures at another transportation company. She respected him, but she had never treated his position as protection from scrutiny. That was why he trusted her. Erin set her case on the narrow ledge beneath the window. Then, until the evidence says otherwise, you are treated like any other reporting passenger. Mason nodded. That is exactly what I need. Dean stared at them. Erin turned to Jonah. Has the record been locked? Yes. Original versions preserved? Yes. Departure clearance? Suspended. She looked toward the aircraft. Has anyone been allowed to change a seat since the lock the gate employee shook her head? No. Erin opened her laptop. Good. Dean stepped toward her. This has been blown out of proportion. Erin did not look up. Your name? You know my name. I want it stated for the record. He took a breath. Dean Rourke, Terminal Operations Manager. Did you approve the change yes based on the lead flight attendant's report? Did you review the original assignment I relied on her assessment? Erin looked up. That was not my question. Dean's jaw tightened. No. Did you speak privately with Mr. Reed? I spoke to him in the cabin. Did you ask for his account before approving the change? No. Did you document an operational reason? Dean looked toward Jonah. No. Erin turned to Mason. What were you told that seat 1A was needed for an operational accommodation? Were you offered another seat, one seat in row 29, and your daughter, she was expected to remain in 1B? Erin's eyes moved to Sophie. How old are you, 10? Did you want to sit away from your father? Sophie shook her head. No. Erin typed something. Did anyone ask you? No. She looked at Mason. Did you sign or electronically confirm the change? No. Did you say you accepted it? No. What caused you to leave the seat? Dean threatened to have security remove me. Erin turned toward Dean. Is that accurate? He was refusing a crew instruction. That is not an answer. Dean exhaled. Yes. I told him security would remove him if he did not comply. Erin continued typing. A cabin chime sounded. Inside the aircraft, Melissa picked up the communication handset. The captain's voice came through quietly. Her expression changed as she listened. Veronica leaned toward her. What is happening? Melissa covered the receiver. Ground operations has suspended departure. For how long I do not know, then find out. Melissa returned to the call. A moment later, she tried to open the passenger list on her tablet. The screen displayed a locked message. She entered her credentials again. The same message appeared. Passenger manifest locked. Executive compliance hold. Melissa looked through the open door. Erin stood beside Mason with her laptop open. Jonah was speaking to an operations supervisor. Dean remained near the wall, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Veronica followed Melissa's gaze. Who is that man? Melissa swallowed. I am not certain. You removed him from the seat. I know. Then why are senior executives surrounding him? Melissa had no answer. Veronica stood. Call the regional office. It appears the regional vice president is already here. Veronica looked again. Jonah Pierce was easily recognizable to people who worked in corporate travel. She had met him twice. Her confidence faltered for the first time. Outside, Erin requested access to the reservation archive. The gate employee connected her laptop to the secure terminal. A loading symbol appeared. How long since Mr. Reed left the seat? Erin asked. The employee checked the event log. 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Mason looked toward the cabin. Inside, passengers were beginning to sense that the delay had changed in nature. The businessman in 2A raised his phone again. The woman in row 3 stood and looked toward the door. A flight attendant asked everyone to remain seated. Veronica approached Melissa. I need a direct explanation. Melissa's voice was quiet. The passenger record is under review. Because of him. Because a change was made. You made the change. Melissa looked at her. You asked me to accommodate you. I asked for service. You told me your company was choosing a preferred airline. That is true. You said employees who understood important clients were remembered. Veronica's expression hardened. Do not blame me for your inability to manage a seating issue. Melissa stared at her. The alliance between them lasted only as long as Veronica believed Melissa could protect her. Now it was gone. The cabin clock reached 5 minutes. The speaker above the first row came alive. The captain's voice filled the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, Crown Line Operations has removed this flight from departure status while a mandatory passenger verification review is completed. Conversation stopped. Please collect all personal belongings and exit the aircraft in an orderly manner. Gate personnel will provide further instructions inside the terminal. For 1 second, nobody reacted. Then the cabin erupted. Passengers called out questions. Overhead bins opened. Seatbelts snapped loose. The woman with the connection demanded to know whether the flight had been canceled. The businessman kept recording. Veronica remained standing beside 1A. "I am not leaving." Melissa lowered the handset. "Every passenger must exit. I am not every passenger." Melissa looked at the locked tablet. "Yes," she said quietly. "You are?" Veronica stared at her. "Make an exception." Melissa's face changed. The fear remained, but something else appeared beneath it. Recognition. That is what caused this. Veronica stepped closer. "Be careful." Melissa did not respond. Passengers filled the aisle. Some believed there had been a security threat. Others whispered about an unauthorized person on board. A man near row 5 asked whether their checked luggage would be removed. Owen moved through the cabin, helping passengers retrieve bags. When he reached Sophie's former row, he looked at the folded boarding pass beneath Veronica's hand. He saw Mason Reed's name. Then he looked through the doorway at Jonah standing beside Mason. Owen's expression shifted. He reached into his pocket and touched his phone. Avery waited until the aisle cleared enough for her to stand. She retrieved her bag and moved toward the door. As she entered the jet bridge, she saw Mason surrounded by senior leadership. Dean stood apart from the group. Sophie remained beside her father, holding the straps of her backpack. Avery heard one of the supervisors address him. "Chairman Reed Operations has secured the aircraft." She stopped, only for a moment. Then she walked past the executives and crouched in front of Sophie. "How is your breathing?" Sophie nodded. "Better. Any dizziness? No. Chest hurting? No." Avery smiled. "Then you are doing well." She checked the backpack. Scout still safe. Sophie touched the rover case. "I think so." Avery stood. Mason looked at her. She had heard his title. She had walked past 3 executives. She had not asked him a single question about Crown Line Airways. Her first concern was still Sophie. "Thank you," Mason said. Avery looked at him. For what? For seeing her? Avery glanced at Sophie. She was not difficult to see. Their eyes held for one quiet second. The noise around them continued. Passengers complained. Radios crackled. Airport staff guided people toward the terminal. Yet something calm formed between Mason and Avery, something untouched by the sudden shift in power. Veronica emerged from the aircraft behind her assistant. She was furious until she saw the group waiting in the jet bridge. Jonah stood beside Mason. Aaron worked at the secured terminal. 2 operations supervisors waited for Mason's instructions. Dean remained pale and silent. Veronica slowed. Jonah turned toward Mason. "Chairman Reed, the original manifest is loading now." The words passed through the jet bridge. Passengers stopped speaking. Several looked back at Mason. The businessman lowered his phone. The woman who had complained about her connection stared at the worn coat she had judged minutes earlier. Veronica's eyes moved over Mason's face. "You are the chairman." Mason turned toward her. "I was the same passenger when you thought I was nobody." Veronica's lips parted, but no words came. Aaron looked at the screen. The original reservation appeared first. Mason Reed, seat 1A. Sophie Reed, seat 1B. Veronica Hale, seat 3D. Aaron opened the activity history. A second version appeared. Mason's name had been removed. Veronica's had replaced it. A voluntary change code sat beside Mason's reservation. Aaron studied the timestamp. Then she turned toward Melissa as the flight attendant stepped out of the aircraft. "You did not just reassign his seat." Melissa stopped walking. Aaron rotated the screen so everyone could see it. "You falsified his consent." Aaron's voice was quiet, but it carried farther than a shout. Melissa stood at the edge of the jet bridge with one hand still wrapped around her tablet. Behind her, the empty aircraft waited beneath the soft glow of cabin lights. The seats were vacant now. Overhead bins hung open. A paper cup rested in an abandoned armrest. The scene looked ordinary. The record on Aaron's screen did not. Melissa stared at the words beside Mason's name. Voluntary cabin reassignment. Her lips parted. I was trying to prevent a delay. Erin turned the laptop toward herself again. That does not answer what I said. I believed he had accepted the change. Mason looked at her. You believed that after I asked you to document the reason for removing me, Melissa swallowed. You stood up. After Dean threatened to call security, you complied with an instruction. That is not consent. Melissa tightened her hold on the tablet. Veronica stepped forward. This is becoming ridiculous. Several passengers turned toward her. Only minutes earlier, people had made room when she moved. Now, nobody stepped aside. Veronica looked toward Erin. The man left the seat. Whatever language your system uses is an internal matter. Erin's expression did not change. The language in the system determines whether the airline records a voluntary choice or an involuntary action. It was a seat change. It was a false statement attached to a passenger record. Veronica lifted her chin. You are speaking as though someone forged a passport. No, Erin said. I am speaking as though an employee entered information she knew was not true. Melissa looked toward Dean. He remained near the wall, silent. For the first time since the confrontation began, he avoided her eyes. Erin noticed. Mr. Rourke, come closer. Dean did not move immediately. Jonah folded his arms. Dean. He stepped toward the secured terminal. Erin opened the approval history. A second line appeared beneath Melissa's entry. Manager authorization, Dean Rourke. The approval had been submitted 47 seconds after Melissa selected the voluntary change code. Erin looked at Dean. What did you review during those 47 seconds? Dean glanced at Mason. I reviewed the crew report. The written report, Melissa gave me a verbal summary. Erin looked at the screen. There is no written operational reason. I was told the passenger was obstructing boarding. Did you inspect his boarding pass? No. Did you inspect Ms. Hale's boarding pass? No. Did you ask whether a minor child would be separated from her parent? Dean's face tightened. I understood that temporary supervision was available. You understood that from whom? The cabin crew. Erin waited. Dean looked toward Melissa. She stared at the floor. Erin continued. Did you speak with Sophie? No. Did you ask Mason whether he agreed to the change? He was refusing the instruction. That was not my question. Dean exhaled. No. Did he sign anything? No. Did he press an electronic confirmation? No. Did he tell you he was willing to sit apart from his daughter? No. Erin closed the approval panel. Then you approved a voluntary action without evidence of a voluntary decision. Dean looked at Jonah. This is being framed unfairly. Jonah's voice remained controlled. You approved what is on the screen. I approved a crew action during active boarding. We make fast decisions every day. Fast decisions still require facts. The flight was at risk of delay. Mason looked at him. You keep returning to the clock. Dean turned. That is because on-time performance affects every passenger on that aircraft. Mason glanced toward Sophie. She was a passenger. Dean said nothing. She was not a number beside a departure time. She was a child asking why adults were treating her father like a liar. Mason's voice did not rise. That made Dean's silence heavier. Avery stood beside Sophie near the terminal entrance. One hand rested lightly against the strap of her bag. She watched Mason without interrupting. She could see the effort behind his composure now. Every question he asked sounded precise, but his attention kept returning to Sophie. He was not trying to win an argument. He was trying to repair something his daughter had just witnessed. Erin reopened the original reservation. There was no operational conflict, she said. Seat 1A belonged to Mason Reed. Seat 1B belonged to Sophie Reed. Seat 3D belonged to Veronica Hale. She turned toward Melissa. When did you first verify those assignments? Melissa hesitated. When Mr. Reed showed me his boarding pass and Ms. Hale's at the same time. So you knew there was no duplicate booking? Yes. You knew there was no equipment change? Yes. You knew there was no medical requirement attached to Seat 1A? Yes. You knew Ms. Hale had a confirmed first-class seat. Melissa's eyes moved toward Veronica. Yes. Erin leaned back slightly. What changed? Nobody spoke. The passengers remained gathered near the gate entrance. Some held their bags against their chests. Others stood with phones lowered at their sides. A child began crying somewhere near the boarding desk. The sound passed through the silence and faded. Aaron looked at Melissa. What changed between the moment you saw the tickets and the moment you described the assignment as an irregularity? Melissa glanced at Veronica again. Veronica's expression hardened. Do not look at me. Melissa's face changed. The fear was still there, but something beneath it had cracked. You told me Hail Dominion was selecting a preferred airline. Veronica stared at her. I stated a fact. You said employees who understood important clients were remembered. I did not tell you to move anyone. You looked at seat 1A. Because it was the seat I requested. You asked why a man like him was sitting there. Veronica's voice sharpened. That is not what I said. The businessman from seat 2A raised his phone. I recorded part of it. Every face turned toward him. He was in his early 40s, dressed in a navy business suit with a red tie loosened at the collar. Until that moment, he had remained near the back of the group, watching. Now, he looked uncomfortable. I started recording after the argument got loud. Erin held out her hand. May I see it? He looked at Mason. Mason did not nod or refuse. The man walked forward and unlocked the phone. My name is Brian Keller. Erin entered his name into her notes. Did you edit the recording? No. Did you stop it at any point once when they moved into the aisle? Then I started again. Send both files to this secure address. She gave him the information. Brian sent the videos, then handed the phone to Erin so she could review the originals. The first recording began with Veronica standing over Mason. Her voice came through clearly. People who belong in first class do not need to argue that they belong in first class. The passengers listened. Several looked down. The video captured Mason holding up his boarding pass. It captured Melissa acknowledging that Veronica's assignment was farther back in the cabin. It captured Veronica speaking about standards and important relationships. Then Sophie's frightened face appeared near the edge of the frame. Avery's voice came from across the aisle. His ticket matches the seat. The recording continued. It captured the suggestion that Sophie remain in first class while Mason moved to row 29. It captured Avery objecting. It captured Dean entering the cabin and apologizing to Veronica before asking Mason a single question. Finally, it captured Sophie looking at her father. Dad, did we do something wrong? The sound of her voice changed the people listening. The woman who had complained about her connection covered her mouth. Brian lowered his eyes. Erin paused the video. Why did you record this? Brian rubbed the back of his neck. I thought it might become an argument. That does not answer the question. He looked toward Mason. At first, I thought it was dramatic. His voice weakened. Then I realized he had the correct ticket. Why did you not speak? Brian looked around at the other passengers. I did not want to get removed from the flight. Avery's expression tightened. Brian continued. I told myself the video would be useful if something happened. Something was happening, Avery said. He nodded. I know. The admission came without defense. Mason looked at him for a moment. Did you send the recording to anyone? No. Did you post it? No. Then keep it that way until Sophie's face can be protected. Brian looked at Sophie. Of course. Mason's voice softened. Thank you for preserving it. Brian seemed surprised by the gratitude. I should have done more. Mason did not disagree. Before he could answer, Owen stepped from the aircraft. He held his company phone in both hands. Melissa turned sharply. What are you doing? Owen stopped. He was young enough that the authority in her voice still reached him instinctively. Jonah saw it. Owen, come forward. Owen looked at Melissa once more, then walked toward Erin. My name is Owen Brooks, junior flight attendant. Erin entered it into the report. What do you have? Owen unlocked the phone. The cabin tablet froze during boarding. It came back after a few seconds, but I took a photograph of the seat map in case we lost the meal assignments. Melissa stared at him. You photographed passenger information on a company device. You did not have permission. I followed the backup procedure from training. Melissa opened her mouth. Erin raised one hand. I will determine whether the procedure was followed. Show me the image. Owen turned the screen around. The photograph showed the original first-class seating chart. Mason Reed in 1A, Sophie Reed in 1B, Avery Collins in 2C, Veronica Hale in 3D. The timestamp was recorded 12 minutes before the confrontation. Owen moved to a second image. I took this after Melissa changed the assignments because the meal list did not match the passengers anymore. The second photograph showed Veronica in 1A. Mason had no seat. Sophie remained in 1B. Aaron compared the images with the system history. The times aligned. Did anyone instruct you to take the second photograph? No, why did you do it? Owen looked toward Sophie. Because it did not seem right. Melissa's voice came quickly. You are a junior crew member. You did not understand what was happening. Owen's hands tightened around the phone. I understood that his boarding pass said 1A. You heard only part of the discussion. I heard Ms. Hale speak to you before you approached him. Veronica stepped closer. What exactly do you claim you heard? Owen looked at Aaron. She nodded. Answer only what you personally heard. Owen swallowed. Ms. Hale said Hale Dominion was choosing a preferred airline for 1,200 employees. Veronica crossed her arms. That is public information. She said employees who understood important clients were remembered when executive recommendations were made. I never promised her anything. Owen continued. Melissa told her that seat 3D was confirmed. Ms. Hale looked at Mr. Reed and asked why someone dressed like him had been given the front row. Veronica's face went still. That is a lie. Avery spoke. It is not. Veronica turned toward her. You were not close enough to hear a private conversation. I heard the end of it. So now the nurse is an airline investigator, no, Avery said. I am still the passenger you told to behave like one. A few people looked away to hide their reactions. Veronica's assistant stood several feet behind her with the leather case against his leg. He had remained silent throughout the investigation. Aaron looked toward him. Your name? The assistant hesitated. Veronica answered for him. He is not involved. Aaron kept her eyes on him. I asked for your name. Elliot Ward. Were you present when Ms. Hale spoke with Melissa? Elliot glanced at Veronica. She gave him a warning look. Aaron noticed. You are not required to protect either person standing here. You are required to answer truthfully if you choose to give a statement. Elliot looked toward the passengers, then toward Sophie. Yes, he said. Veronica's face changed. Elliot, he kept his eyes on Aaron. I was standing behind Ms. Hale. Did she mention the corporate agreement? Yes. Did she refer to employees being remembered? Yes. Did she ask Melissa to falsify a record number? Veronica seized the answer. There, that is the end of it. Aaron did not look at her. Did Ms. Hale make clear that she expected seat 1A because of the business relationship? Elliot closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Veronica's voice dropped. You should think carefully about your employment. Mason turned toward her. That sounded like a threat. It was advice. To an employee providing evidence. He works for me. Mason looked at Elliot. Not inside this investigation. Veronica laughed once. You are enjoying this more than you pretend. Mason's expression remained steady. You keep assuming this is about humiliation because humiliation is the only consequence you recognize. Her jaw tightened. You emptied an aircraft to make a point. No. I emptied an aircraft because the official record was unreliable. You could have fixed the seat assignment. I could have fixed my seat assignment. He stepped closer. That would not tell me how often employees have done this to passengers who could not call the chairman. The word silenced the gate again. Erin turned back to her laptop. She opened Dean's compliance archive. At first, only routine entries appeared. Baggage disputes, boarding complaints, upgrade errors, service delays. Then she filtered for involuntary seat changes. A list populated the screen. There were more cases than anyone expected. Erin opened the first file. A mother traveling with 2 young children had reported that one child was moved 12 rows away after a celebrity's assistant requested adjacent seats. The complaint had been marked resolved. There were no interview notes, no crew statement, no follow-up. Erin opened another. An older passenger said he had been pressured into surrendering a confirmed premium seat to a corporate executive. He claimed a gate manager threatened to remove him for non-compliance. Resolved. No witness contact. A third complaint involved a newly married couple forced into separate economy seats after a high-value customer demanded their row. Resolved. No evidence reviewed. Every file contained the same manager authorization. Dean Rourke. Jonah stepped closer. How many? Erin continued scrolling. 7 in the last 14 months that matched the pattern closely. Dean shook his head. They were minor service complaints. Erin opened one of the files. This passenger provided 2 witness names. They did not respond. There is no record that anyone contacted them. Dean's face tightened. We do not have unlimited staff. Aaron opened another. This family submitted photographs of the original boarding passes. The crew reported a system error. Did you verify the system history? No, why not? The complaint was closed after travel credits were issued. Aaron looked at him. You did not resolve the complaint. Dean said nothing. You paid the passenger enough to stop calling, then removed the evidence from active review. That is not what happened. Aaron opened a fourth case. This passenger wrote that you personally warned her that continued complaints could affect future travel. Dean stared at the screen. I explained the disruptive passenger policy. She was not on an aircraft when you spoke with her. Dean looked toward Jonah. Jonah's expression had gone cold. Mason stood quietly beside Sophie. He felt no satisfaction. The more files Aaron opened, the less the morning belonged to him. There were other fathers, other mothers, other children who had looked at the adults around them and wondered why a valid ticket had become meaningless. Mason glanced down at Sophie. She was watching Aaron's screen. He touched her shoulder. You do not need to listen to all of this. Sophie looked at him. Did they do it to other kids? Mason did not lie. Yes. Her eyes returned to Dean. Did anyone help them? No one answered. Avery stepped closer to Sophie. Somebody is helping them now. Sophie looked at her. Avery did not smile. The moment did not need reassurance that was too bright. Mason watched Avery lower herself slightly so Sophie did not have to look up. The movement was small. It reached him anyway. Aaron closed the complaint archive. She looked at Jonah. I recommend immediate suspension of Dean's operational access pending an independent review. Dean stepped forward. You cannot suspend me based on incomplete files. Jonah removed his radio from his belt. I can suspend your access while the files are investigated. Jonah, you approved false passenger information this morning without review. I trusted my lead attendant. You also controlled 7 earlier complaints involving the same pattern. That does not prove misconduct. No, Jonah said. It proves you should not control the evidence. He called airport operations, disabled Dean Rourke's terminal credentials, and remove him from active duty. Dean's face drained. This is my career. Jonah lowered the radio. That is why the investigation matters. Dean looked toward Mason. Please. Mason met his eyes. Dean stepped closer. If I had known who you were, I would have handled this completely differently. The passengers heard him. So did Sophie. Mason's expression did not change, but Avery saw the pain behind it. That is the problem, Dean. Dean tried to speak. Mason continued. You believe I deserved fair treatment after you learned my title. No, that is not what I meant. It is exactly what you meant. I was under pressure. So was my daughter. I made a judgment call. You never gathered enough information to make a judgment. Dean looked toward Veronica. She was a priority corporate client. Mason's voice lowered. The boarding pass was valid before Jonah recognized me. Sophie was 10 years old before anyone called me chairman. The rules protecting both of us did not become more important when you learned my name. Dean's shoulders fell. A supervisor approached and asked for his identification card. Dean stared at it for several seconds before unclipping it from his belt. He handed it over. I want a chance to explain. You will have one, Mason said, but you will not control the records or the employees who speak. Dean looked toward Melissa. She stood near the aircraft door, pale and motionless. Aaron turned to her. Your company access is suspended effective immediately. Melissa's grip tightened around the tablet. I have worked here for 17 years. That is documented. I have never had a major violation. The review will determine that. I made one decision under pressure. Aaron held out her hand for the tablet. Melissa looked toward Mason. Her eyes were wet now. I was trying to protect the company. Mason looked at the empty aircraft behind her. You protected the possibility of a contract. That contract could create jobs. You did not know whether it would. Ms. Hale made it sound certain. Mason glanced at Veronica. She made her influence clear. Melissa's voice broke. What was I supposed to do? Avery answered before Mason could. Read the tickets. Melissa looked at her. Avery's expression was not cruel. That made the answer harder to dismiss. Aaron kept her hand extended. Melissa slowly surrendered the tablet. Then she removed her silver name badge. She held it in her palm as though it weighed more than it had inside the cabin. A supervisor escorted her toward the terminal office. Owen stepped aside to let her pass. Melissa stopped beside him. For a moment she looked like she wanted to speak. Owen lowered his eyes. She continued walking. Veronica watched both Dean and Melissa lose their authority. She remained the only person still standing, as though the morning could be controlled through force of personality. She turned toward Mason. Hale Dominion will reconsider every dollar it spends with Crown Line. Mason faced her. That is your company's decision. You have not seen the final proposal. I have. Veronica's expression shifted. The message on Mason's phone that morning had carried her company's name. The realization reached her slowly. Mason continued. The projected value is substantial. Then you understand what you are risking. I understand exactly what Crown Line would receive. He looked toward Sophie. I also understand what you expected in return. That is insulting. You demanded a confirmed passenger seat because you believed your account made you more valuable than he was. I requested appropriate service. You mocked my clothing. You refused to cooperate. I showed you the correct boarding pass. You could have moved without creating a scene. Mason glanced around at the passengers. You created the scene when you decided another person's dignity was part of your upgrade. Veronica's face reddened. You are emotional because your daughter was present. A silence passed through the gate. Mason took one step toward her. Sophie's presence made the failure more painful. His voice remained controlled. It did not make the record false. It did not enter your name into Seat 1A. It did not cause Dean to approve a change he never reviewed. Veronica folded her arms. You are prepared to lose a major corporate agreement over a minor seating dispute. Mason looked at Jonah. Suspend all negotiations with Hale Dominion. Jonah nodded. Veronica stared at him. You cannot be serious. Mason returned his attention to her. A contract that depends on employees ignoring passenger rights is not an opportunity. Our board will hear about this. So will ours. You think your investors will choose your feelings over millions in revenue? Mason's eyes hardened. If revenue requires Crown Line employees to decide that wealthy passengers deserve more truth than everyone else, then the price is too high. Veronica looked toward the surrounding passengers. No one met her eyes with admiration now. Her assistant Elliot remained near Aaron, completing his statement. Veronica moved toward the gate entrance. A security officer stepped into her path. She stopped. What are you doing? Jonah approached. You are no longer cleared to re-enter the aircraft. I have a confirmed ticket. So did Mason. The words came from Avery. Veronica looked at her. Avery did not move. Jonah continued. You will be rebooked through a different carrier after security completes its report. You cannot remove me from a public airport. We are removing you from Crown Line's restricted departure area. Veronica looked toward Melissa, but Melissa was already gone. Then she looked toward Dean. He stood without his identification card. Finally, she looked at Mason. This is not over. Mason held her gaze. No, the review has just begun. Security escorted Veronica toward the terminal. Her white coat moved through the crowd like a bright flag. The same clothing that had commanded attention inside the cabin now made it impossible for her to disappear. When she was gone, the gate seemed to exhale. Passengers began speaking softly. A woman approached Mason. She was the one who had complained about her connection. I owe you an apology. Mason looked at her. She held her purse against her chest. I knew your ticket was probably valid. I just wanted the flight to leave. He nodded. I understand. Her eyes filled with embarrassment. That does not make it right. No. She waited for him to forgive her. Mason did not offer easy comfort. What will you do differently next time? She looked toward Sophie. I will speak. Mason nodded once. That matters more than apologizing to me. Brian Keller approached next. I should have stopped recording and said something. The recording preserved evidence. That is not why I started. Mason appreciated the honesty. Brian looked at Sophie. I am sorry you had to hear people blame your father. Sophie studied him. Were you afraid they would remove you too? Yes. She considered the answer. I was afraid too. Brian's face changed. The child had given him no excuse, only a mirror. He nodded. I know. One by one, other passengers offered statements to Aaron. Some had heard Veronica mention the contract. Others had seen Melissa confirm the boarding passes. Two admitted they had believed Mason did not belong in first class because of his clothing. Erin recorded each account. She did not let apology replace evidence. Near the windows, Sophie sat at a small table and opened her backpack. Avery joined her. "Let us check Scout." Sophie removed the padded case. The Rover looked intact, but the front wheel had loosened again. Sophie sighed. "It hates airports." Avery turned on the flashlight on her phone. "Most intelligent machines do." Sophie took out the tiny screwdriver Mason had packed. Avery held the light while Sophie adjusted the locking pin. Mason watched from several feet away. Jonah came to stand beside him. "She is good with Sophie." Mason glanced at him. Jonah looked toward Avery. "I meant the nurse. I know who you meant." Jonah almost smiled. "I have not seen you look at anyone like that in a long time." Mason's expression closed slightly. "This is not the morning for that conversation." "No, it probably is not." Jonah stepped away to answer a radio call. Mason remained where he was. Avery said something that made Sophie laugh. The sound reached him through the noise of the gate. For one brief moment, he could imagine Lauren standing beside him, hearing it too. The thought did not feel like betrayal. It felt like grief opening a window. Mason walked to the coffee counter beside the lounge entrance and returned with 2 cups. He placed one beside Avery. "Black coffee." She looked up. "How did you know you ordered it at the other counter?" "You remember small details during corporate disasters, only the important ones." Avery accepted the cup. Sophie looked between them, then returned to the Rover with visible concentration. Mason sat across from Avery. For a moment, neither spoke. Beyond the windows, rain softened over the runway. A Crown-Line aircraft lifted through the low clouds and disappeared. Avery took a sip. "You do not look like a chairman." Mason looked at his coat. "I have been told that was not an insult." "I know." She watched Sophie tighten the wheel. "Why did nobody recognize you? I do not spend much time in advertisements." "That sounds intentional." "It is." He explained that he booked personal travel without executive markers. He wanted to see the company as ordinary passengers experienced it. Avery looked toward the empty aircraft. "You found out." Mason's expression changed. "I found out too late for people who complained before today." "You did not approve what happened to them." "No, but you built the system that failed to catch it." Mason met her eyes. Most people around him softened difficult truths. They treated his position like glass. Avery did not. "That is what I keep thinking," he said. She nodded. "Good." He looked surprised. Good people with power become dangerous when they decide every failure happened beneath them. Mason looked toward Erin, who was still reviewing old complaints. "The board will ask why local management was able to close those files without independent review. What will you tell them? That we designed a system that trusted the wrong people without checking their work." Avery held the coffee between both hands. "And then we change it." She studied him. "Not just because Sophie was there. No, not just because it happened to you, no." Avery looked toward Sophie. "Then maybe this morning becomes more than something she has to recover from." Mason followed her gaze. Sophie was speaking softly to Scout as she tested the wheel. "She has already recovered from too much." Avery heard the weight in his voice. "Her mother." Mason nodded. "Lauren." He had not said the name to Avery before. "She died 3 years ago. I am sorry." The words were simple. Avery did not ask how. Mason found himself answering anyway. "She had an autoimmune illness. It became aggressive near the end." Avery lowered her eyes. "She was in the hospital for 6 weeks. Was Sophie there more than I wanted her to be?" Avery looked toward the memorial ribbon. "That is why you are going to Denver. Lauren grew up there. Her family holds a gathering every year. And the science competition, Sophie insisted on doing both. That sounds like her." Mason smiled faintly. "It does." He looked down at his hands. "Since Lauren died, I have tried to be calm enough for both of us." Avery said nothing. The silence invited honesty without demanding it. Mason continued. "She already lost one parent. I do not want her to feel that the other one can fall apart." Avery leaned back. "Being strong for a child does not mean convincing her you never hurt." Mason looked at her. "Sometimes it means showing her that hurting does not make you unsafe." The words reached somewhere he had kept closed for years. Avery glanced toward Sophie. She trusts you because you stayed with her inside the fear, not because you hid yours. Mason looked at his daughter. He remembered the cabin, Sophie asking whether they had done something wrong, his own anger pressing against every careful word. He had believed restraint protected her. Perhaps some of it had. Perhaps some of it had only taught her that pain should be carried quietly. Sophie looked up from the rover. "It is fixed," Avery smiled. "Test it." Sophie placed Scout on the table. The rover rolled forward, sensed Avery's coffee cup, and turned neatly before reaching the edge. Avery raised her eyebrows. It noticed trouble. Sophie looked pleased. Before everyone else. Mason smiled. For the first time since boarding, the expression reached his eyes. Erin approached with Jonah. "We have enough to keep the flight suspended until the cabin is rebuilt," she said. Mason stood. "What about the passengers? Operations is preparing a replacement aircraft. Earliest departure is this evening," Jonah added. "We can move connections, arrange hotels, and provide compensation." Mason looked toward the gate lounge. "Every affected passenger receives a dedicated agent. No automated rebooking." Jonah nodded. "Meals and lounge access?" "Yes." "Transportation for anyone who cannot continue?" "Yes." Erin closed the laptop. "The formal employment decisions will require full review." "They should. Melissa and Dean will both have the right to submit statements. They should have that too." Erin studied him. "Some people will say that is more fairness than they showed you." Mason glanced at Sophie. "We do not repair a failure of due process by denying it to someone else." Erin nodded. "That will be in my report." She moved away with Jonah. Avery looked at Mason. "You really meant it when you said this was not about the seat." Mason looked toward the aircraft window. "No." Sophie closed the rover case. Avery checked the time on her phone. "My conference starts tomorrow morning. The science competition does too," Sophie said. "Where is it? The Denver Museum of Nature and Science?" Avery smiled. "My hotel is 3 blocks away." Sophie looked at Mason, then back at Avery. "You could come see Scout." Avery did not answer immediately. She looked at Mason instead. "Only if your father thinks it is appropriate." The question felt larger than the museum. Mason understood that she was not asking for access to the chairman of Crown Line Airways. She was asking whether there was room beside a father and daughter still carrying someone they loved. He looked at Sophie. Her hope was impossible to hide. Then he looked at Avery. "I think Scout could use an expert in noticing trouble." Avery smiled. "Then I will be there." An announcement sounded near the gate. Crown Line representatives began calling passengers by name to arrange new travel. The crowd slowly separated into smaller groups. Some passengers approached Erin with statements. Others moved toward the service desks. Sophie slid her backpack over her shoulders. Mason offered his hand. She took it. Avery walked beside them as they entered the lounge, 3 figures moving together beneath the bright terminal lights. No one knew yet which seats they would receive on the replacement flight. For the first time that morning, Sophie did not ask. She was no longer holding only her father's hand. Avery walked close enough that she did not feel alone. Inside the lounge, Crown Line employees moved from passenger to passenger with tablets, meal vouchers, and revised itineraries. Mason did not disappear into a private office. He stood near the center of the room with Sophie beside him and waited until the conversations grew quiet. "My name is Mason Reed," he began. "I am the chairman of Crown Line Airways, but today I was also a passenger on Flight 482. Several people lowered their eyes. The delay was caused by an unauthorized change to a passenger record. Once that record could no longer be trusted, the aircraft could not depart until every traveler and assignment had been verified again. He looked across the room. "I know explanations do not restore missed meetings, connections, or time with your families. Crown Line is responsible for the disruption, and we will treat it that way. Every passenger received a dedicated agent. Those who could not continue that evening were offered hotel rooms and transportation. Travelers with connections were placed on alternative routes. Meals, lounge access, and compensation were arranged according to the disruption each person had suffered." Mason accepted their frustration without defending himself. A man near the windows asked why one altered seat required everyone to leave the aircraft. Mason answered him directly. Because an employee entered information that did not reflect what happened. Until we knew whether any other passenger data had been changed, we could not certify that the people inside the cabin matched the record used by the crew and ground operation. The man nodded slowly. The explanation did not make the delay pleasant, but it made the decision understandable. A replacement aircraft became available shortly after sunset. By then, the rain had stopped. The runway lights shone against the wet pavement like long strings of gold. A gate agent approached Mason with 3 boarding passes. "Mr. Reed, seats 1A and 1B have been restored for you and Sophie." She handed Avery a separate pass. "Ms. Collins, your upgraded seat is 2C." Sophie looked at her father. Mason placed the boarding passes inside his coat pocket. As they walked toward the gate, he noticed a woman near the service desk supporting a boy with a brace around his right leg. The child looked about 12. His face was pale and every step appeared painful. The mother carried 2 bags while trying to keep one arm around him. Mason stopped. "Are you traveling on the Denver flight?" The woman nodded. "Yes, we were moved to the rear cabin." She looked embarrassed by the difficulty. "My son had surgery last week. We were supposed to be home hours ago." Mason turned to Sophie. He did not take the tickets from his pocket. "What do you think?" Sophie looked at the boy's brace, then toward the first-class boarding lane. She understood immediately. "He needs more room than we do." Mason handed the tickets to the gate agent. "Move them into 1A and 1B." The agent hesitated. "Those are your confirmed seats." "I know." The woman stared at him. "We cannot accept that." Sophie stepped closer and held out the tickets. "We want you to." The boy looked at her backpack. "Is that a robot or rover? Does it work most of the time?" He smiled. The tension in his mother's face softened. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason nodded. This time it is a choice. When boarding began, Mason and Sophie were assigned 2 seats in row 18. They entered the aircraft without ceremony. Sophie placed Scout beneath the seat in front of her and settled beside the window. Mason sat beside her. A few minutes later, Avery appeared in the aisle. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and sat across from them. Mason looked toward the front cabin. "You gave up your upgrade." Avery fastened her seatbelt. "I was afraid the power was changing me." Sophie laughed. Mason shook his head. "That seat had more legroom. So does the conference hall tomorrow." The aircraft door closed. This time the passenger list had been verified twice. Every child traveling with a parent was seated correctly. Every change carried a recorded explanation. As the plane moved away from the gate, Sophie reached for Mason's hand. He felt her fingers tighten during takeoff. Avery noticed from across the aisle but did not intervene. She understood that Sophie did not need a nurse in that moment. She needed her father. When the aircraft leveled above the clouds, Sophie released his hand and looked toward the front. "If we were going to give the seats away, why did we fight so hard?" Mason considered the question. "We did not fight because first class was more comfortable, but they were our seats." "Yes, and now somebody else has them because we gave them away." Sophie waited. Mason turned slightly toward her. "Giving something away is a decision you make for yourself. Having it taken because somebody believes you matter less is different." Sophie looked toward the front cabin. So the seat was not the important part. The choice was. Avery looked out the window, giving them privacy, but Mason knew she had heard. Sophie rested her head against his shoulder. A few minutes later, she fell asleep. Mason covered her with his coat. Across the aisle, Avery opened a medical journal but did not turn the page. "You are cold now," she whispered. "I will survive. She trusts you." Mason looked down at Sophie. "I hope so." Avery studied him. "She does not need you to be perfect, I know. Do you?" Mason looked at her. There was no challenge in her voice, only concern. "I am learning." Avery finally turned the page. "That sounds more believable." They arrived in Denver late that evening. The city lights stretched beneath them, scattered across the dark land below the mountains. At the hotel entrance, Avery adjusted the strap of her bag. "My conference begins at 9. Sophie presents at 10:30, Mason said. Avery looked toward Sophie. "I will try to be there." Sophie pointed at her. "You said you would come." Avery smiled. "You are right. I did." The following afternoon, Mason and Sophie attended Lauren's memorial gathering at her mother's home. Photographs covered the living room walls. Lauren as a child beside a mountain lake, Lauren at college, Lauren holding Sophie in the hospital after she was born. Family members shared stories that made Sophie laugh and cry within the same minute. Near the end of the gathering, Sophie removed a small silver wheel from her pocket. It had belonged to the first rover she ever built with her mother. She placed it beside Lauren's photograph. "This one never worked," Sophie said. Lauren's mother smiled through tears. "Your mother loved it anyway." Sophie looked at Mason. She loved broken things. Mason crouched beside her. She loved things people were still trying to understand. That evening, after Sophie had fallen asleep at the hotel, Mason stood by the window. Snow covered the distant mountain peaks. Cars moved quietly along the streets below. He held Lauren's wedding ring between his fingers. Since her death, he had worn it on a chain beneath his shirt. "I am trying," he whispered. He was not asking permission to forget her. He never would. He was admitting that part of him had begun to move again. The next morning, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science was crowded with students, parents, judges, and unfinished projects. Sophie stood behind a display table, checking Scout's sensors for the third time. Mason watched her rearrange the same two tools. "You are nervous, no. You put the screwdriver on the left." She looked down. "I always put it on the left. You put it on the right at home." Sophie moved it. Do you think she forgot Mason knew who she meant? No. Before Sophie could ask again, Avery entered the exhibition hall carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag. Sophie ran toward her. "You came. I was promised a machine that notices trouble before everyone else." Avery handed Mason a cup. "Black coffee. You remembered. I am good with details." She opened the paper bag. "And emergency pastries." Sophie looked inside. "Those are muffins. They became emergency pastries when I ran 3 blocks carrying them." Sophie returned to the table, suddenly less nervous. When the judges arrived, Scout rolled across the platform, detected a wooden barrier, and changed direction before reaching it. One judge leaned closer. "Why did you design it to respond so early?" Sophie looked at Mason. Then she looked at Avery. "Because warnings usually appear before a collision." The judge nodded. "And what happens if nobody responds?" Sophie rested one hand beside the rover. "Then a small problem becomes something that affects everyone." Mason felt Avery's eyes meet his. Sophie completed the presentation without forgetting a single line. She did not win first place. She received an award for practical design and stood on the small stage holding a blue ribbon while Mason took more photographs than she believed necessary. Afterward, Avery checked the time. "I have to return to the conference." Mason walked with her toward the museum entrance. Behind them, Sophie showed Scout to another student. For several steps, neither Mason nor Avery spoke. Then Mason stopped. "Sophie likes you." Avery looked at him. "Sophie has excellent judgment." Mason smiled, then became serious. "I like you too." Avery allowed the silence to remain. Mason was grateful for that. He did not want the words rescued by humor. "When we get back to Charlotte, would you have dinner with me?" Avery glanced toward Sophie. Then she looked at the chain visible near the collar of Mason's shirt. She understood that the ring resting beneath it would not disappear because he invited someone new into his life. "Yes," she said. Mason released a breath he had not realized he was holding. Avery took one step toward the door, then turned. "Somewhere without a VIP section. That can be arranged." 3 weeks later, Aaron's independent review was completed. Melissa's employment was terminated for falsifying passenger consent and knowingly moving a confirmed traveler without a valid operational reason. Dean was dismissed for approving the false record, failing to protect a child traveling with a parent, and closing earlier complaints without proper investigation. Both had been allowed to submit statements and appeal through the company process. Veronica's premium privileges were revoked. Crown Line ended negotiations with Hale Dominion. Her own company opened an ethics review after Elliot and other witnesses provided statements. Owen entered Crown Line's leadership development program. At the recognition meeting, Mason handed him a small silver pin. "Leadership is not protecting the most powerful person in the room," Mason said. "It is protecting the standard when the powerful person wants it broken. Crown Line then introduced new rules across every airport it served. A passenger could no longer be marked as voluntarily reassigned without written or electronic confirmation. Any seating change involving a child triggered an automatic Guardian review. Complaints involving influential customers went directly to independent compliance. Employees were protected when refusing instructions that violated procedure. Old cases connected to Dean's office were reopened. Families who had been ignored were contacted. Months later, Mason traveled anonymously through another Crown Line terminal. Near the gate, a wealthy passenger demanded that an ordinary family surrender 2 confirmed seats. The young gate employee checked both boarding passes. "I am sorry," she said, "but their tickets are valid. Your assigned seat is the one printed on your boarding pass." The passenger complained about status and corporate spending. The employee remained calm. A confirmed ticket does not become less valid because another customer is more influential. The family stayed together. No manager intervened. Nobody recognized Mason. His phone vibrated. A message from Avery appeared. "Sophie says you are late for dinner." Mason looked once more at the family entering the jet bridge. Then he turned toward the exit. He had possessed enough authority to empty an aircraft and walk away from a valuable contract. But the change that mattered most happened in a quiet terminal where nobody knew his name. The system had protected an ordinary family simply because protecting them was right. The seat had never been the point. The point was making certain dignity no longer depended on who was sitting in it.